Hey there, biologists. Welcome to Need to Know video number 5. Before we get started, I have to show you guys my pretty cool shirt. I got involved in a grant up to Michigan Tech University. They're up in the UP, very far away from here in Lansing. It's about 8 hours, 8.5 hour drive from here. But I got 11 free graduate credits to go up there and study engineering, like biological engineering. It was really cool. So check out my cool t-shirt. Nerdy, right? You guys like that? It's from the periodic table, of course. So I got to wear that today, so I just wanted to show it off a little bit. Today in our Need to Know video, we are going to analyze how all living things release energy from food. Like I said, this is Need to Know video number 5, and it covers lessons 9 through 12 in our course tree. Let's look at our learning targets for today. By the end of this video, you need to be able to write the equation for cellular respiration in both words and in symbols. You need to be able to explain the 3 stages of cellular respiration. I want you to explain how organisms get energy in the absence of oxygen, and also compare photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Let's start off with our think about it part. So do you like to run, bike, or swim? These are all good ways to exercise. When you exercise, your body uses oxygen to get energy from glucose. This is a sneak peek as to what cellular respiration really is. So how does your body feel at the start of an exercise? You maybe feel pretty good, right? Like you could just run forever. And then how do you feel maybe 1 minute into the run, or maybe 10 minutes into the run? You might feel like you're running out of breath, like you don't have enough oxygen. You're breathing a lot faster. Maybe your heart rate is going a lot faster. Your blood is really pumping. Why might your blood be moving more quickly? You know, your blood delivers oxygen to cells. What do you think is happening in your cells to cause the changes in how you feel? How come you might feel more tired or exhausted the longer you run? Think about it at the cellular level. What might be happening there? And think about running as fast as you can for 100 meters. Could you keep up that pace for much longer distance? Why or why not? A person who does not usually exercise will find it more difficult to run 3 miles than someone who runs frequently. Why do you think this is so? You've heard people train for marathons. What does that mean? So pause this video and think about those things right now. All right, let's move on. So where do organisms get energy? We've already talked about this, so you should have an idea of where we're getting our energy from. You can see here that we're going to be converting the energy stored in glucose into usable energy that our cells can use. This will be ATP. We've already talked about that just a little bit. We know that organisms get their energy from the food that we eat. For example, producers like plants are able to make their own food. That's the process of photosynthesis. Since you and I and other animals can't eat their own food, we're consumers, and we can't make our own food. We have to get our food from eating something else. So we'll either eat producers or we'll eat another consumer that has eaten a producer. But ultimately, all that energy is coming from the sunlight, and the producers can do photosynthesis to transform the energy in sunlight and the carbon and carbon dioxide to make glucose. That's the food that we're eating. So then when we eat our own food, here comes glucose. And our glucose is going to enter our mitochondria. That's where cellular respiration takes place. And we need to transform that glucose into ATP. We're building on everything we learned in Need to Know video number 3 and number 4 in this video today. So make sure that you've watched those other ones before moving on. So the food molecules that we eat contain energy. The energy is stored in the bonds of those molecules. So in like the bonds of glucose, the bonds of lipids, the bonds of protein, that's where all of that energy is going to be stored. That energy is released when the chemical bonds in our food are broken. When we digest our food, we're breaking those chemical bonds and we're able to release that energy. Cells don't just burn food and release energy as heat. It isn't like a really quick process. Instead, they break them down. Our cells are going to break down that food in a series of stages. We have multiple steps. That's kind of what this image is showing us, right? Looks like there's 3 different stages of cellular respiration: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. These can get they are very detailed. You won't need to know all of the details, but you need to know the basic understanding that our cells don't just do one process and get all of our energy extracted from our food lickety split. Instead, they go through a series of different steps or stages to break that down. This allows them to capture bits of energy as they go through these stages. That way, cells can use the energy stored in the chemical bonds of food, like glucose. Remember that energy is converted to ATP. The energy stored in our bonds of glucose is going to be converted throughout this process of cellular respiration into ATP. Once the energy is in ATP, now we can use it to power the cell. Like we learned about in Need to Know video number 3, ATP is the energy currency for cells. And once that energy is stored in ATP, now our cells can use it whenever we need to. So what is cellular respiration? Here's kind of the general idea. When oxygen is present, that's important. When oxygen is present, cells burn our macromolecules. They can burn things like carbs and lipids and proteins. You know that our diet consists of those carbohydrates. Lipids would be like fats, and proteins come from all different things, but we typically think of proteins like eggs and milk and meat. So when these macromolecules literally burn inside of our cells, it releases energy in the form of ATP. Similar to how we can burn gasoline to power our cars, we can burn these macromolecules because there's a lot of carbon in there, and that carbon is storing that, the bonds between the carbons are storing all of the energy. When we can release it in the form of ATP, that's the end goal of cellular respiration, because we want that ATP to power all of the activities in our cells. Now, of course, carbon dioxide and water are also released. A good way to remember this is when cellular respiration is just like regular respiration, just at the cellular level. So every cell in my body right now, I have trillions of cells in my body. They're doing cellular respiration. So they're breaking down these macromolecules and releasing carbon dioxide and water. That carbon dioxide and water is traveling through my bloodstream back to my lungs. And when I exhale, when I respire, when I do respiration, I'm breathing out that carbon dioxide and water. Sometimes students forget, they remember that we're breathing out carbon dioxide because you've probably heard that before, CO2. But students tend to forget that we also breathe out water. But imagine what happens on a really cold day and you go outside and you breathe. What can you see coming out of your breath? You see those water droplets in the form of, it looks like steam, right? So when we breathe out, we also are breathing out not just CO2, but also water. You could also go up to some glass and go, and you can see those water droplets condensing on the glass. That's how you know that there's also water in your breath, not just CO2. So where does cellular respiration happen? It happens in our mitochondria. This is why we call our mitochondria our power plants. Remember when we learned about cell organelles back in Need to Know video number 1? We said that the mitochondria converts energy. This is where now it's all going to make sense to you. This is that process of cellular respiration where the mitochondria are converting the energy found in glucose and other types of macromolecules into the energy of ATP so that our cells can use that ATP. Like I said, it's called the powerhouse of the cell for a reason. Let's move on to our first need to know, our first learning target today. Write the equation for cellular respiration in words and in symbols. So just like with photosynthesis, there's really two ways to look at this. Both mean the same thing though. So we could say it in words or we could say it in symbols, and you need to know both of these for the upcoming unit test. So cellular respiration, we have our reactants over here on the left side of our arrow, and we have our products over on the right side of the arrow. Reactants are like our ingredients. So what do we need for cellular respiration to take place? Think about it. What do? You breathe in, and there's oxygen in the air, and then you also eat. And when you eat, you get things like glucose. I could replace this with lipids. I could replace it with proteins. We typically look at glucose because it's a good example. However, we could put other macromolecules into this spot. So really we're Breathing in, we need oxygen and we also need glucose. What happens? We know we breathe out carbon dioxide, we breathe out water like we just talked about, and we're also making and converting that energy that was stored in the glucose into ATP. Sometimes instead of energy over here, you'll see ATP, perfectly fine. Okay. So our reactants would be 6 oxygen molecules, 1 glucose molecule, and our products are 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules. Make sure that you know these numbers. It's not too hard to remember, right? Everything is 6 except for just the 1 sugar molecule, that 1 glucose. Oh, and then also energy, and like I said, sometimes we'll see ATP instead of the word energy. Here's our key if you're still not too familiar with these. Make sure that you know these on the test, okay? I'm going to have a couple of questions, and you might need to write this out in like a short answer, so be able to do that. Okay, so when does cellular respiration happen? All of the time. Whenever organisms need energy for cellular processes, and your body is constantly doing work. Your body constantly needs energy. All organisms, including producers, do cellular respiration. This is a really common misconception. A lot of times, even if you ask adults, who does photosynthesis? Adults know that plants do. If you ask who does cellular respiration, they'll say, oh, animals. And they totally forget about plants, but producers. Every living thing is going to need to do cellular respiration because if you think about it, plants need energy too, right? And the energy currency in plants and in all living things is ATP. So although plants are able to make glucose from the sunlight and carbon dioxide, they still have to then take that glucose in from the chloroplast into the mitochondria and convert that glucose into ATP so they can use it too. They have to do things like grow and transport materials as well as animals do. A good way to remember this here's our mitochondria. So here's our reactants and our products again. You might want to take a little screenshot. This might be a good one to include in your notes. Good way to remember that plants need to do this is if you think about what's in a plant cell, we know that plants have chloroplasts and animal cells don't. So we know plants can do photosynthesis and animals can't. But we also know that plant cells have mitochondria. Well, what's the whole point of having a mitochondria? It's your powerhouse. It's for cellular respiration. So the fact that plants have mitochondria and animals do as well should help you remember that this process of cellular respiration is happening in both of these types of organisms. Now let's move on to our next learning target, which is to explain the 3 stages of cellular respiration. I'm really summarizing it and making it as easy as possible for you guys. You need to know everything that's on this slide. So first comes glycolysis. That's our first stage, and it always needs to start with glycolysis. This is where a little bit of energy is captured to synthesize or make 2 ATP molecules. Here it is. And look at that again. Without it, we have glucose, and we're going to make some energy, synthesize 2 ATP molecules. That's what's happening in glycolysis. At the end of glycolysis, about 90% of the energy that was available in glucose is still locked up. It's locked up in this molecule called pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid. So we've gotten a little bit of energy. Remember, we said that this happens in a series of stages, but we still have 90% of it is still stored in this pyruvic acid. So we're not done yet, right? We need to move the pyruvic acid into another stage so we can get more energy from that molecule. That next stage is called the Krebs cycle. Now, in the Krebs cycle, the pyruvic acid is going to go through this cycle. I'll show you a picture in a minute. It gets really complex, and it goes through kind of a series of stages. And in those series of stages, some important things happen. First of all, we're going to synthesize 2 more ATP, and oxygen is needed for this cycle, so we call it an aerobic process. Oxygen is going to be needed. And we also, if you notice, this is when our carbon dioxide comes out. Remember we said one of the products of cellular respiration is carbon dioxide? Here it is. So we have so far glycolysis produced 2 ATP and some pyruvic acid. Our pyruvic acid went into the Krebs cycle to produce 2 more ATP, so we're slowly getting there, and a molecule of carbon dioxide. I forgot to mention, but glycolysis is anaerobic. Anaerobic means without oxygen. This process can occur with or without oxygen. However, the Krebs cycle can only occur with oxygen. And as we move on to the electron transport chain, this process can only occur with oxygen. So anaerobic, aerobic, aerobic. Think about aerobic when you do aerobics. What are you doing? You're breathing a lot. Think of that. You need oxygen in order to do that. So that's a good way to remember it, anaerobic versus aerobic. Anaerobic is without oxygen. Aerobic is with oxygen. Sorry, a little side note there. All right, so where are we at now? We just went through the Krebs cycle. We got some carbon dioxide and 2 more ATP. What happens next? Well, we're going to have some molecules now enter the electron transport chain. Sometimes we'll call this the ETC, electron transport chain. Most of our energy is going to be synthesized here. Big difference, right? We've only gotten 2 ATP, 2 ATP. How many come out of the ETC? 32 ATP. That's a lot. So the electron transport chain is really where it's at. That's where we're getting most of our ATP from, that original glucose molecule. Now the electron transport chain requires the products from stages 1 and 2. So if these don't occur, we can't skip ahead and go for the big bucks down here with a lot of ATP. We need to have these 2 processes happen before. Like I said, oxygen is needed for this stage, so it's very important that oxygen is present. Here's our overall summary. So we got 2, 2, and 32. Could you add those up and tell me how many ATP are produced from one glucose molecule? Sure, 32 plus 2 is 34 plus 2 is 36. You're going to need to know that too. One glucose molecule produces 36 total ATP. Another thing that I noticed down here is, remember when we need oxygen, one of our reactants of cellular respiration is oxygen. You breathe it in. When you breathe out, you get rid of that CO2, and that was in the Krebs cycle. And then you also get rid of water that's in your breath. Remember that water is also coming out of the electron transport chain. So we can see our reactants and our products of cellular respiration just by looking at this diagram. Oops, I forgot to put an animation. Hold on, let me go add that. Okay, I should have said spoiler alert. So when you look in the book, you guys, and you learn about the process of cellular respiration, like it says in your lessons, this is glycolysis. It gets pretty complicated. Remember, that was our first stage. This is the Krebs cycle. Oh, it gets really complicated, doesn't it? All of these different stages. Look at how we have CO2 coming out. We have NADP plus turning into NADH, and then we have FAD turning into FADH2. We have a bunch of different types of citric acid. We have a bunch of different carbon molecules here. So that's the Krebs cycle. And oh my gosh, look at the electron transport chain. Remember, all of this is happening inside of our mitochondria. So that's what this big structure is. And there's some proteins embedded in this layer inside of the mitochondria. And we have a lot of electrons and different types of molecules jumping around. Guess what? You don't need to know all of this. Okay, so really what you do need to know is, back on this slide, our 3 stages of cellular respiration. So please make sure that you're studying this, because all of this will be on your test. However, I'm not going to require you to know all of these 3 different stages. The reason why is, as an individual out there in society after high school, unless you're moving on to become a scientist, you don't need to know this. And if you are moving on to become a scientist, you'll take classes like this where you'll learn more about cellular respiration in college. Okay, all of the materials there, in case you're really interested in it. You can look into your book. You can also go through the lesson. However, you will not be tested on the unit test on this information. So you can send me a thank you very much webmail if you'd like. It's just kind of inappropriate for 9th grade or 10th grade level. All right, so let's talk about our energy totals. I kind of already jumped ahead because I get excited about this. So how much ATP does cell respiration generate? Well, we said, yep, 2 is coming from glycolysis, and we know 2 is also coming from Krebs, and then we know where our big money's at down there in the electron transport chain, we get 32 ATP coming from that ETC. And so how much total? 36 ATP are made from one glucose molecule. Yes, you will need to know that number, so make sure you're studying that and you know the breakdown of how many are coming from where. Now remember, we also talked about we can look at our equation for cellular respiration, and we know that 6 oxygen molecules are required. That's down here in the electron transport chain. We know that glucose starts out the whole thing. That's up here, C6H12O6. And then we know that 6 carbon dioxides are produced. That's coming out of the Krebs cycle. 6 water molecules are produced, and that's coming out of the electron transport chain. And then we have bits of energy coming from all 3 different stages. So I want you to know these too. Maybe on your test I'll white out these, and you're going to have to fill them in. I could white out the reactants and the products. That actually sounds like a really good short answer question, so maybe I'll do that. So make sure you really study this diagram, okay? Okay, here's some think about it questions to make this a little bit more relatable to like real life, okay? So you know that your cells are doing this process constantly, but you might be thinking, what about other types of food? Like we said, we just typically talk about glucose in that reaction, but of course we're eating other things besides just sugars. We know that complex carbohydrates are broken down to simple sugars like our glucose, but our lipids, which would be like our fats and our proteins, like our steak or our hamburger that we're eating, can be broken down into molecules that enter the Krebs cycle or glycolysis at one of several places. So a good way to remember this is think about a furnace. A furnace can burn lots of different things, can burn oil, gas, wood. A cell can burn those macromolecules and generate chemical energy in the form of ATP from just about any source that we're eating. How efficient is cellular respiration? So if we jump ahead, it says the engine of a typical automobile burns gasoline, but it's not incredibly efficient. It's actually really not efficient at all. But our cells are actually really efficient at breaking down the molecules that we're eating to get energy from that. It says the 36 ATP molecules generated represent about 36% of the total energy of glucose. So that's actually quite efficient. What happens to the remaining 64%? It's released as heat, which is one of the reasons why your body feels warmer after you exercise, why your body temperature is constant throughout the day and the night, around 37 degrees Celsius, 98.7. Is that what our body temperatures are? I can't remember after converting to Celsius. But yeah, so we have... Remember when we were thinking back to the food chain and we know that 10% of the energy moves from trophic level to trophic level? Don't confuse that with this. This is within our cells. But remember we said that a lot of the energy, like 90%, is released as heat. And at that time you were thinking, well, why 90%? Like, what does she mean heat? This is it. When cellular respiration is happening, we're releasing loads of energy as heat energy, and that's given off of our bodies. That's why we're able to maintain homeostasis and stay warm. So it all should be making sense now that 90% of energy is released from cellular respiration. Okay. All right, so now we need to talk about what if oxygen is not present. This is called anaerobic. Remember we said an, if you put that before any word, the prefix a or an will be like the opposite of. So we talked about biotic and abiotic. Abiotic was the opposite of biotic. Just like anaerobic and aerobic, anaerobic is the opposite of aerobic. Okay, so it's good to know those prefixes. So when there's no oxygen present, we call that an anaerobic process. Fermentation is going to take place, and I bet you've heard of fermentation. You know that things can ferment. Remember, this is what glycolysis looked like. And yep, there's some of the details of glycolysis here. And then remember that pyruvic acid moved into the Krebs cycle. Fermentation is a process that we'll see looks similar to this, but there's going to be a little bit more down here at the bottom. Fermentation releases energy from food by making ATP without oxygen. cells are going to convert NADH to NAD+. You can see that NADH is made during glycolysis. We're going to reconvert that into NAD+, so this process can continue to occur. It can continue to happen without oxygen present so that we can get little bits of ATP. We'll get 2 total ATP every time that this happens. There's 2 forms of fermentation. Both are going to start with pyruvic acid and NADH. And remember, we're not going to send that NADH to the electron transport chain. We're not sending that pyruvic acid to the Krebs cycle. Instead, we're just going to kind of recycle those in this fermentation cycle so that we can get little bits of ATP along the way. This is what it looks like. There's 2 different types of fermentation. This looks really scary at first, but we'll break it down. Don't worry, it's not too bad. We have alcoholic fermentation. So you've heard of this before, alcohol. This is the process by which yeast and other microorganisms, like bacteria, are able to convert glucose into ethyl alcohol, which is alcohol. This produces alcoholic beverages and causes bread dough to rise. Really what's happening here is we started with our glucose. It's being converted into pyruvic acid, just like we saw before. This is the process of glycolysis. Same thing we've looked at before. Remember, we said glycolysis doesn't require oxygen, so this can happen. What happens as well? We have NAD+ converting into NADH, and we're also making 2 ATPs from that process. Once we have our pyruvic acid, now it can move into alcoholic fermentation, which is in this lower left box. What's happening here? We're going to use those 2 NADHs that we just made and put them back into NAD+. That NAD+ cycles back and starts this process again, so we can keep going. What else happens? Alcohol is produced. We already talked about our NAD+, so that's one of our products. We also know alcohol is produced, 2-ethyl alcohol. So when we're seeing alcoholic beverages being made, that's that alcohol. And then also 2 carbon dioxide molecules are produced. If you've probably seen beer before, an alcohol. It has bubbles in it, and those bubbles are carbon dioxide. If you've eaten bread, which I'm sure all of you have, bread rises from the dough. It's really dense, and it rises as it bakes. That rising is due to the carbon dioxide. So when you slice a piece of bread and it's kind of, it looks like there's little holes sort of in it, those holes are carbon dioxide that has been stuck, and that's what's caused the bread to rise. It's kind of cool. So it's that CO2. Okay, so that's alcoholic fermentation. You do need to know this equation, so please make sure that you jot this down. Remember, alcoholic fermentation, first we're starting with glucose, we're converting that to pyruvic acid, and then NADH is needed for that fermentation to take place. What's our products of alcoholic fermentation? Some ethyl alcohol, carbon dioxide, and NAD+. NAD+ is going to be recycled, and we start the process again. Remember, all of this is happening with no oxygen present. Also, humans are not doing alcoholic fermentation. We don't ferment glucose or pyruvic acid and turn it into alcohol in our bodies. Really, this is only happening in yeast and other microorganisms. Now, lactic acid fermentation occurs in most everything, most organisms, including us. So we're doing this type of fermentation. The purpose of it is to provide short, quick bursts of energy. Say you don't have oxygen present in your cells, your body still needs a way in order to get some quick ATP if it's needed. It's also used to produce cheese, yogurt, and pickles. So we have other microorganisms that are able to do this type, and this is how we're fermenting, like milk into cheese and yogurt. We're fermenting cucumbers into pickles. It's this process of lactic acid fermentation. Very similar to what we looked at before. We know that glycolysis happens just like we've already talked about. We know that we are producing our NADH, and we're turning that back into NAD+. So here's our NADH. Remember, that was produced, and here it is again. So we're cycling that back because we're going to need NAD plus to start the process of glycolysis again. So that's like a cycle. What else is going to be produced? Oh, and our pyruvic acid is entering this. It's a reactant entering this cycle. Pyruvic acid is going to turn into lactic acid, just a different type. That lactic acid is produced as well as NAD+. No carbon dioxide is produced in this process, just lactic acid and NAD+. So make sure that you memorize both of these equations. I won't put the numbers, so I'm not going to ask 2 ethyl alcohol, 2 CO2. Don't worry about the numbers. I just want you to get the general idea of what the reactants and the products are for each of these. Now let's talk about this in real life. Why do we care about lactic acid fermentation? It all goes back to the energy we need and exercise. So humans have 3 sources of ATP. We have ATP that's already in our muscles. We can make ATP from lactic acid fermentation. And we can also make ATP by cellular respiration. I forgot to mention, but in our lactic acid fermentation, how many ATP molecules were produced? Do you guys remember? It was only 2. So this is not like very efficient. We don't really want to do lactic acid fermentation. If oxygen is present, our cells are going to go ahead and do the whole process of cellular respiration because we would like to get more ATP from one glucose molecule if possible. When no oxygen is present, we really don't have a choice and we have to do lactic acid fermentation. It's really an inefficient process. We're taking one of those really valuable glucose molecules and only making 2 ATP from it. It's kind of lame, right? So those are 3 ways that we can get ATP. We know that this one's probably the best. Cellular respiration, we get a lot more ATP from that one glucose. Okay, so at the beginning of a race, let's say that you're on the track and you're competing against other runners and the gun shoots off. What happens at the very beginning? ATP in your muscles is used up in the first few seconds. That's our first supply of ATP. ATP from lactic acid fermentation is going to come next because you probably don't have tons of oxygen in every single cell in your body. So instead, we gotta get that ATP. About the first 90 seconds of your run is going to be lactic acid fermentation. And then ATP from cellular respiration is needed to continue the exercise after about 90 seconds. So if you think about running, you could probably sprint for maybe a minute and a half. And then after that, you're really going to be out of breath. You're inhaling really deeply. You're getting that oxygen into your body and you're sending that oxygen throughout your body using your bloodstream so that you can continue running. And that oxygen is needed for cellular respiration. All right. Now we have to move on to our last learning target to compare photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Remember we looked at our symbols for photosynthesis there, and let's take the reactants, right? So we're going to start out with carbon dioxide and water. If you haven't realized this already, I'm about to blow your mind, all right? So we got carbon dioxide and water are reactants of photosynthesis. We also know that light is needed, so let's add that in. Draw an arrow. Now what's going to happen? Photosynthesis can now happen because we have all of the ingredients or the reactants needed. What happens after photosynthesis? What are our products? Well, we know that there's a glucose that's produced, a sugar molecule, and some oxygen. All right, so now what's needed for cellular respiration? Oh my goodness. Glucose, sugar, and oxygen is needed for that process. Okay, so then what happens now? I guess we can do cellular respiration. And then once we do cellular respiration, what's produced? Oh, carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Look at this cycle. It's a continuous cycle. The reactants of photosynthesis are the products of cellular respiration. The products of photosynthesis are the reactants of cellular respiration. So we can compare and contrast these, and we can even draw a cycle showing how the reactants of one are the products of the other. That's what page 253 in your book is about. This is one of those big picture aha moments that you need to make sure that you're getting. You can look at this diagram. You can look at the one on the previous page. I'd like you to pause this video now and read this. If it's for some reason too small, go to page 253 in your book. Make sure that you understand this. This is like one of the biggest concepts about biology class. This is part of the carbon cycle. All right, I have a quick video that I'm going to play for you now. This is also going to reinforce how the reactants of one are the products of the other, and hopefully we can get it to load. All right, this is a 4-minute video, and I have some questions for you on your worksheet, so make sure you try to find those answers as you listen. Let's watch now.
Ever wonder where most of the food you eat every day comes from? Well, about 60% of the food you eat is carbohydrates. As you can probably tell from its name, carbohydrates contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But where do these atoms originally come from, and how do they join together to make delicious foods like fruits and pasta? It actually all starts with the air you are exhaling at this very minute, specifically the carbon dioxide molecules. Plants are going to breathe in this very same carbon dioxide through pores in their skin called stomata. Plants drink in water from their roots to get the needed oxygen and hydrogen atoms, and their electrons, in order to build carbohydrates. What is that thing? Well, that's a special plant organelle inside the leaves of plants called a chloroplast. It's green because of a special light-absorbing pigment called chlorophyll. Each leaf has about 44,000 cells, and every cell can have anywhere between 20 to 100 chloroplasts. That's up to 4,400,000 chloroplasts. By now, you've probably guessed that we're talking about the process of photosynthesis, and you might be wondering when the sun is going to make its entrance. Let's go back to that original molecule of water. The plant has to split this molecule of water so that it can get electrons from it. But the plant can't pull that water apart by itself. It needs help from the high energy rays of the sun. So now that the chloroplast has all the building blocks, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and electrons, it can use them to go through the rest of the steps of photosynthesis to transform that original carbon dioxide gas into a simple carbohydrate called glucose, C6H12O6. That little glucose molecule then helps to build bigger and better carbohydrates like cellulose. Cellulose is a type of carbohydrate found in plants that our body cannot break down. We call it fiber, and we eat it in vegetables like lettuce, broccoli, and celery. Plants use cellulose to keep themselves strong. The plant could also turn that glucose into starch, a large molecule that stores energy for the plant. We love eating starch from plants like potatoes, corn, and rice. So you see, when we eat plants, we're actually benefiting from photosynthesis. The plant makes things like starch, which we eat and then break back down into glucose, the first form the plant made. Then, the mitochondria in our cells, powered by the oxygen we breathe, can turn glucose into pure energy molecules called ATP. ATP powers all work done by each and every one of your cells, things like communication, movement, and transport. But why do we have to turn that glucose into ATP? Well, think of it like this. You're excited to start your summer job at the local ice cream stand, but your boss has just told you that she is going to pay you in ice cream cones. What are you going to be able to do with those ice cream cones? Nothing, which is why you kindly ask to be paid in dollars. ATP is just like dollars. It is the currency that all cells of life use.
And we talked about that in Need to Know video number 3. We talked about ATP, and we used that example of needing to convert our energy found in glucose into a different form so that our cells could actually use it. That's just another example that she gave you with the ice cream and the money. We're seeing that conversion that needs to take place.
Glucose is, well, kind of like ice cream. Even plants have mitochondria in their cells to break down the glucose they make into ATP. So as you can see, humans and plants are intricately connected. The air we breathe out is used by plants to make the carbohydrates we enjoy so much. And in the process, they are releasing the very same oxygen molecules we need to breathe in order that our mitochondria can break down our delicious carbohydrate meal.
Okay, so that's everything we've talked about in a nice little summary. Here's our double down question for today. In certain cases, regular exercise causes an increase in the number of mitochondria in muscle cells. We've talked about this before in a previous Need to Know video. How might that situation improve an individual's ability to perform energy requiring activities? Think about the phrase, if you don't use it, you lose it. If you're not using your mitochondria by exercising a lot, why would you have tons of mitochondria in your muscle cells? On the flip side, if you're using your mitochondria, you're regularly exercising, don't you think your cells would start to produce more mitochondria because of that exercise? So try to figure out this answer on your own and make sure that you're practicing your writing on your Need to Know worksheet. Okay, here's our exit ticket for today. I know today's video was a little bit longer, but hopefully it was a good intro to cellular respiration for you. Remember, I cut out a lot of stuff. This might be a video you want to review a few times before you take the test because I know it's not easy. There's a lot going on. Bye, biologists. Have a great day.